Shalom, everybody. Good evening. Good evening to you, Amos and Frank. I thank you for inviting me. The INSS is a leading institute both in Israel and in the world. I follow your publications and I use them quite often. And Amos, chapeau for the way you lead the institute. With your permission, I'd like to talk about 5 main issues in this lecture. I'd like to describe the operative and strategic situation. I want to talk about the IDF response, and I want to focus on something very central, and that is the way where we should operate the military force in an era of a populated battlefield in urban areas. And I want to say a few words about Iran. And with your permission, I'll conclude with a few words about the challenges that face us this time. The IDF operates in 6 arenas in 6 dimensions. I want to illustrate it within 1 week during December. 1 week let's say it started on Sunday. In that day, we attacked quite extensively in a state, let's call it State A. We attacked a production site and also weapons. The next day, the Iron Dome, as part of the defense system in the Gaza Strip, it detected 2 rockets. The same headquarters of the Air Force, together with the Southern Command, attacked that evening. In response, 3 targeted in the Gaza Strip. One of them was a production site, very significant, that took away a lot of their capabilities. In between, we operated a commando operations, not in the first circle, and 2 days later, we attacked again in the same area, which I called Area A. At this time, we prevented the transfer of weapons from A to B. It was supposed to be operated towards the State of Israel. And in the meantime, the Central Command, every single night, about 10 arrests. Some of them could have attacked in the Axis 443 or in settlements. And that entire week, but defending cyber attacks together with the Shabak and defending from cyber attacks, which we are under quite often. All these activities that I described compel us to have accurate intelligence, operational force capabilities in all the circles. But in all these activities, we have a lot of risks as well. Some of these campaigns is like flying very, very fast in a very narrow canyon. We have to make sure that soldiers are not hurt, that people who are not involved will not be hurt, and even to make sure not to harm our colleagues that are working all through the Middle East. The IDF operates at least in 6 arenas in 6 different aspects. The arenas are Syria, Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, the Central Command, the Judea and Samaria area, Iran, and other places. The aspects and the dimensions are air, sea, land, cognition and awareness, spectrum, and cyber. Cyber, in the last few years, we really enhanced our activity in the offensive side of it. You have to think about it. All in all, we're talking about an unprecedented situation that the state has to operate in 6 arenas, 6 dimensions, and that necessitates us to have a lot of things. Intelligence. It also necessitates us operational capabilities. Also, all the time to have order of priorities and to make educated decisions. How activity in arena A can have an impact on B, positively or negatively. But all in all, we have to be aware, to be concentrated 360 degrees all the time. If this is not enough, apart from Iran, all the other arenas are such that there's no real governance there, or no governance at all. Syria, of course, is a good example, but South Lebanon is another example, or even the state of Lebanon. There's partial governance. The decision makers are Hezbollah. It's not even the government. Same for other arenas, but the fact that there's no governance by a sovereign state has two negative impacts. One, there are more challenges to the IDF. And second, it takes from us part of our freedom of action, of things that we would have done if they were sovereign countries. And all that I just described around us are at least 5 struggles in the Middle East between superpowers and terror organizations or even religions, in Libya, in the Mediterranean, in Lebanon, of course, Syria. In all these places, I want to take Iraq as an example. You can actually ask why do we care about Iraq? But we do care. The fact that Iran cannot control its territory and to hold itself as a sovereign state enables the Iranians to operate the militias and to transfer weapons from Iran through Iraq to Syria and Lebanon, so that the chaos in Iraq has an impact at the end of the day on us as well. I spoke about the enemies, but I want to describe to you in a different approach what they think about us. I'm not saying it by estimate, but I know. First of all, they perceive us as having a very high intelligence capability, and they perceive themselves as infiltrated. And of course, that causes their own self-confidence in their activities and decision-making. The second thing, Israel is perceived as one that operates on a very high level all over the Middle East. As a result of that, Israel is perceived as one that can defend itself, can protect its borders and assets. And the last thing is that Israel is perceived as initiator and active. It's the one that goes to campaigns, it's the one that attacks, thwarts, and this, of course, contributes a lot to the deterrence of the State of Israel. I spoke about deterrence, and I want to talk now about the strategic situation in general. In general, you can say that the strategic situation of the State of Israel is improving. If we talk about deterrence and decisiveness, I would say that deterrence among all the nations that we have to cope with has strengthened. Deterrence is not a thing that cannot be broken. But in general, none of these countries want to initiate any attacks against us. All their activities is response, reaction to what we do. It's not things that they initiate. When they decide to do something, they tackle difficulties, and then they decide to forget this type of activity. And maybe the most important thing is that we do not identify at the moment that any of our enemies or the states around us, and there are enemy countries, is planning or wants to initiate war or a big campaign against the State of Israel. If we talk about deterrence, I would say that they're right, our enemies. Intelligence-wise, we are in many places, not in all places, but we do find ourselves in many places. And operation talking, we have freedom of action all through the Middle East. I don't take it as self-evident. The State of Israel had many decades where it didn't have such freedom of action in the Middle East. And that, of course, creates a strategic position which is much stronger. All our enemies are in a very low situation. The economy, the coronavirus, which is very badly controlled there, and very deep lack of trust and disappointment from the way their regimes or the heads of their organizations take care of it. Together with that, the State of Israel and the IDF are strengthening their alliances. The cooperation and the superpower that we have the biggest relations, best relations, is the United States. And I tell you, this is a strategic cooperation which is extraordinary, both in strategy as well as operation. From one year to the other, we have more cooperation, and we come to a level of intimacy which is really high. With Russia as well, it's not self-evident. We have understandings and even coordinations. Egypt and Jordan the cooperation and tightening of the military relations are getting stronger. The normalization creates a wave against our enemies, and many of them, by the way, were isolated anyway, and now they're even more isolated. If we look at the wider scope, we can look for a moment about this part of the Middle East and to see that vis-à-vis the Shiite axis from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, actually vis-à-vis that, there's a bombastic and strong regional alliance. Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf countries, and the State of Israel is within that alliance. This is a development unprecedented. Not only that, the Iranians themselves, they see in this development like a grip, a geographic grip from the south, but also ideological grip, or even religious one, in all aspects. And above all, I'm still under the title of strategy. The test is the defense and security. This is also the first test in which the IDF has to excel. If we judge according to this test, I think that we can say that the IDF supplied and supplies in 2020 security and safety to the State of Israel. It was one of the most tense years, but very stable, with very few casualties. And all that doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't. This is thanks to a very good intelligence, effective border defense, capabilities of attacks, thwartings, and arresting, and that can change as well. With all these successes, eventually the enemy can have a success here and there. As opposed to that, the operative situation throughout the years is becoming more and more complex. Complex enough to have an impact on strategy as well. The main change, the main development, we called it terror armies in urban populated areas. Why do we call it armies? Because of the fact that today they have tens of thousands of combatants. They have battalions or brigades or whatever. They have very regular weapons. And why terror? Because of the fact that they target very clearly their fire. They target the fact that they want to attack civilians in the State of Israel, not soldiers, not the army. Also, but not only. Within that, of course, we have the trajectories and the missiles and rockets. The scope is bigger. The warheads are more, the accuracy is better, and it came to very significant dimensions. In addition to that, in the last decade, both Hezbollah and Hamas built forces that for them, they can invade Israel at a certain day. We are doing everything possible to stop it. But this is a negative development. In addition to all that, more and more they keep very sophisticated weapons, really. Who would think that a terror organization, today we call it a terror army, will have cruise missiles or accurate rockets or cyber technology changes the world. We know that. But when technology is available, it's available also to radical Islam and fundamentalism. And when one meets the other, the result is challenging. Together with all that, what happens in the axis in the Northern Command or Syria? We see from now, even more than now, the axis, of course, thanks to activities that we operate throughout the year with all the security forces. But this activity did not stop, and the Iranians don't even plan to stop it. So this activity is going to continue. The war between wars, the war against the enemy is going to continue. ISIS is not, hasn't disappeared. You haven't heard the name for quite some time. But ISIL is not disappearing, neither from Sinai or Jordan or Egypt, and definitely not from Syria. It acts differently, different forms, but ISIS is active and it's part of our enemies. As for the Iranians and the nuclear deal, I'll talk about it later. What about the operational response of IDF? We have 4 priorities. The first is preventing bases of the radical axis in the north. The second thing is a reduction of the strengthening of our enemies, focusing on strategic weapons. The third, improving their readiness to act against Iran. And the last is effective defense of the borders. IDF has 4 things to do: to supply defense, to prevent threats, to prepare for war and win, and to create relevant force. And I'd like to say a few words about each of these. As for defense, we are now finishing a very successful year, and the parameters are: did we prevent attacks? And the second, did we obtain stability in some of these arenas? In the Gaza Strip, that can be a good example to stabilization and security in a certain place. It didn't happen by itself. It happened in a combination of military force and civilian policy. As for military force, we wouldn't get there had we not gone through 3 campaigns. One was a campaign against the Islamic Jihad, where we thwarted or targeted, killed the leader in Gaza, but wasn't enough. We had to thwart and to target leaders and to attack. Every time we came to a decision to attack, whether it be explosive balloons or rockets, the choice was the quality targets of Hamas and the Jihad. This accumulated mass brought us to the recognition that all in all, they understood there's no point in their activity. But I can't present it by itself. It's combined with civilian activity. We enabled them to have more trade, to have more stability, and we enabled the Qatar aid that they are now receiving. This security is not just exerting force, because security is force and brain, sticks and carrots. But these carrots, we have a condition, a very definite condition. We determined a ceiling in the civilian policy, a red line. And unless the mission is solved of returning our MIAs, we are not going to go above this line. The Gaza Strip can be in a different situation than it is today. I say to the inhabitants, to the residents of Gaza, you can be in a completely different situation as far as quality of life. But we're not going to advance beyond this line until our MIAs are returned home. We plan to insist on that in a very blatant way. And I go back to defense. We're going to improve it in intelligence, protecting the borders until the end of the summer. We're going to finish the barriers in Gaza. We'll continue the thwarting of threats. And we're now in the process of establishing smart brigades, like a smart city, changing the brigades in the Judea and Samaria area to smart brigades. With technology and other advanced capabilities, we will actually succeed to thwart terror in a more effective way. And from here, I'd like to go over to the mission of prevention, which got the title of the war between wars. This war has been happening since 2013. What does it mean, war between wars? It means preventive war. The State of Israel went on a preventive war in order to reduce the capabilities of the enemy, to thwart threats, and before war to have them have less good conditions, and through that perhaps to distance the war altogether. 2020 is a year of activity. We attacked more than 5 targets in 2020, but there are many other operations that are not just attacking. There are other things. I can say cautiously that all in all, we reduced quite extensively the capabilities of our enemies to transfer weapons in the air, in land, or in sea. We reduced quite a lot of the transfer of monies that were designated for terror. We reduced some of their capabilities that were already in those countries where they act. And we are cutting methodically. We are exposing and cutting the tunnels in the Gaza Strip. I'm not talking about 5 or 6. I'm talking about much higher numbers. The war between wars is going to continue. Readiness for war. Readiness for war. We are busy with a few things. First of all, 3 kinds of warehouses for weapons. The 2 you know less. The 3rd you know very well, the ones we know. The first 2 is the targets. I'm talking about warehouse, quote unquote. The IDF is making an effort to increase the reservoir of targets, to concentrate them. Just yesterday, I sat on a status, as I do almost every month. The pace of creating targets in IDF grew quite extensively. We have a whole body of 250 people, administration of targets. From morning to night, what they do is to create targets in order to bring a much more significant victory when the time comes. This is the warehouse, so to speak, of targets. But in order to have an effective attack, you need weapons. And therefore, the warehouse of the weapons is also something we need, the real one. We are increasing the scope of our armaments from the rifle at the hands of a soldier to the Air Force, so that in the day when it comes, we will be able to implement all these plans. As for plans, we improved the operational plans to all the areas, and we do the utmost in order to train in very advanced methods that simulate battlefield. We train in urban areas at night. We train in combined units. It can be the Air Force with the Navy, from the not just in the higher echelons, but the real men. We invest a lot of time, more than in the past, in training the commanders, the ones who, at the end of the day, lead the victory is the commander of the base or commander of the brigade. The professionalism of the commanders is a real asset that we are fostering in great attention. The peak this year is going to be a month of war. We're going to drill for a whole month all the systems of the IDF with great scopes in all the arenas and great loads. The last thing I want to talk regarding readiness is a very important project, which is called the regiment as Citron. What we want to do is to complete all the units of the IDF, the people who actually go into the Gaza Strip, to complete them with weapons for day, for night, to arm them, to have more manpower, not just to complete it, but also to strengthen them, to give them interfaces of attack and other means, and also to give them the capabilities so that their action will be more effective. From here, I'd like to go to the last section of the readiness for war in a relevant way, or change. I spoke already about the change of the battlefield, and this change compels us to change as well. The IDF changes throughout the years. During 2019, we had a whole long process, very poignant, on the way that we have to change in order to be relevant and to obtain our missions and our victories. We consolidated the whole concept, and that actually is the main compass of the multi-year program momentum that we are embarking upon for the second year. According to the perception, we're talking about the same things as we did then, and of course you need the spirit of war. But because the enemy is so dispersed and so deployed, and it has rockets and missiles, we have to expose it in a wider scope and to act and destroy it in a wider scope. How do we do that? How do we expose and attack more effectively? We take the capabilities that we have in the IDF, we add to that advanced technologies and new methods of war. I'm not going to elaborate, of course, and you create a multiplication of the capabilities. That's what we did. That's what we are doing. There's a long way to go. There are still many missions, but this is the essence of all the momentum multi-year plan. And I give you just 5 examples. Much more intelligence in real time, many more targets and armaments, many more capabilities for the end units, if it can be a regiment here and there or even a squadron of the Air Force, and upgraded system, information, digital, in order to close the fire circles on the enemy in a more effective way. In addition to that, we're in the midst of digital transformation, or in simple language, connectivity, digital of everyone to everyone. Who is everyone to everyone? The branches, one to the other. The commands, the base of the Air Force, or any unit, any brigade, and connecting the forces on land. That the commander will talk to the tank and will talk to the headquarters of the computer system with the same capabilities, the same coordinates, and that will cause operational effectiveness. In addition to that, we continue to accept very advanced platforms, and we have a series of classified projects with the aim to jump one generation in the form of battle, in a situation where, again, we expose and destroy the enemy in much wider scope. This increase of the attacking factors is the main heart of the multi-year program momentum. But in order to materialize this attacking force, we need conditions and legitimacy to exert the force. Now I'd like to talk about the paradigm that we must change. We, as the State of Israel and the whole world, we have to change in order to exert the military force in a right and moral way in the era of the urban battlefield. The change that took place in the battlefield is very deep. The enemy chose to locate itself in the urban area. It selected to put the weapons and missiles and rockets in the urban area. It ignores extensively from the international law, and the result and the example is that it wants to launch these rockets and missiles on all the cities in Israel. Moreover than that, it deployed all its systems in all the villages, no matter if it's South Lebanon, Beirut, or Gaza Strip. And therefore, it's a duty to adapt, both the State of Israel and IDF and the international community, to adapt the patterns of thinking and fighting, and even the international law, to the way that we must and should fight. What is our response to this pattern of the enemy? First of all, operational plans, and I said, first of all, strategy maneuvering, and I'm not going to elaborate, but in the heart of the plans, operatively, the ability to expose and to destroy. What is the barrier? Actually, the barrier is the population that lives there. The population that lives there lives within the targets inside the battlefield. In every second or fifth house in Lebanon is either a missile warehouse or rocket warehouse. The population lives among the army military targets. We are not going to abandon the values of the IDFs or the Jewish religion or the international law, but they were not designated only in order to prevent harming people who are not involved. The values of the IDF were designated to enable us also to defend our people, our citizens. The international law, there are two basic principles, the distinguishing and proportionate. The distinguishing, you have to distinguish between a military target and a non-military. We are going to attack military targets, but if a rocket is linked to a house, it's a military target or dual target, which has a double use, is also a military target. We're going to attack military target, not any others. And now, to the proportionality. We talk about a proportional relation between the expected military edge as a result of the attack and the damage that will happen to the population as a result of the attack. And that's the change we have to make. The word that people use in Hebrew is proportionality. And proportionality is now has the music of minimalism, of cautiousness. The concept in other languages is proportionality. It's better, although it's some of the people that also got a hue of minimalism. And nevertheless, I suggest we should adopt this concept of proportionality, and in Hebrew you can call it relativity, maybe. And now let's talk about relativity between the damage that will happen because of our attack and the advantage. If we attack one launcher in a room in a house in Lebanon or linked to a house, a populated house, will prevent attack in an apartment house in Israel and scores of Israeli citizens. This is our obligation to attack this launcher. It's our obligation to defend the citizens of the country. And the same goes for attacking all the launchers and all the missiles that we identify. This is the requirement, this is our role, and that's our designation. Today, there's no case in the world. Think about it. Never in the world a case like the State of Israel, which is threatened with so many rockets and missiles from Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran. And obviously, also the attempts from Syria. It is threatened with so many fronts. It's threatened where the objective is to harm citizens in the hands of terror organizations or terror armies that by definitions are trampling over the international law. This is also an opportunity or a duty, perhaps, to remind the citizens of Israel in a clear and honest way. One day, when there'll be war, many missiles will fall on Israel. And we're doing everything in order to prevent that, and it's not going to be easy. But exactly vis-a-vis this threat, we are going to attack extensively, whether in open areas of the enemy or built areas or the buildings of the enemy that stores weapons. And this will prevent a real attack on the States of Israel. In other words, because of intelligence, we're going to attack military targets, which will enable us to materialize the principle of distinction, and then we can then attack in such a way that will give us a military edge. This is the only way to reduce extensively the threat of missiles and rockets on the State of Israel. And after I illustrated the military edge, let me go over to the second part of the equation and to talk about the other damages that will happen. We're talking about abiding by the international law. We're going to alert the population, whether it be in Lebanon or Gaza or anywhere else. We're going to alert and warn and caution them and enable them to leave. And I already alert now the population in Lebanon and in Gaza the moment that the war starts. Actually, the moment that the tension starts, we're going to enable you, but you have to leave the place where you are living, this place which is loaded with rockets and missiles, and you know it is. Just in September, a whole warehouse of weaponry was exploded in Lebanon, and the last week it happened in Gaza. And because these areas are flooded with rockets and missiles, they will be flooded with attacks of the IDF. And if we go back to the remnants of the damage, anybody who leaves will not be harmed. If you decide not to leave, it's your decision. It's their decision. And today already they know that they are living within a field of rockets and missiles. Our legitimacy for a wide attack is the fact that we're going to attack military targets and the military edge that we will produce from that attack. The combination of alerting the population, good intelligence that we have, and the fact that there's no other way, this triple reason will enable us to attack severely, to reduce the threat on the home front and all that without compromising on values and international law. With their own hands, the enemies have turned everything upside down. It's the one who deployed so many rockets and missiles among civilians, and it compels us to attack so extensively in order to reduce this threat. This is a reality that the enemy created, and it's our duty to change. Due to intelligence and cautioning the population, it's going to be a moral attack, and due to intelligence, fire, and maneuvering and lethal approach, it will be effective. The concept proportionality should change to the word in English proportionality. It should absorb the new content, and that is that you don't only check how it impacts the way we attack, but how does it impact the way we are attacking in order to defend our own citizens. The whole concept has to change extensively among anybody who's involved, whether in Israel or in the world. The approach from now on will be of a wide scope attack of the enemy targets, no matter where they are, of course, based on intelligence and alert. We do not have any other reasonable way to take away this threat, and this is our duty. In that respect, this is a moral approach, effective, and this is what we have to do. And this is exactly the expression to the designation of the IDF as Israel Defense Force. I touched upon one of the first challenges in the first circle, but I want to talk about another challenge in the third circle, and that is Iran. Iran is first and foremost a regional and world problem. It's not the problem of the State of Israel. Iran, it's a state that feeds terror all over the world intensively, especially in the Middle East. And above all, there's no question. Today, nobody doubts that Iran is thriving, is willing to create its capability to become nuclear and maybe to use a nuclear bomb the moment they make a decision. If the Iran deal from 2015 would have materialized, at the end of the day, Iran could have obtained a bomb because the deal did not include the limitations that will stop it at the end. To date, Iran increased the enriched material above what is allowed. It enriched to much higher levels. It developed and creates advanced centrifuges, which will enable it to storm to the creation of a bomb much quicker, maybe months or even weeks. We saw recently with the change of administration in the United States, and the Iranians said they want to go back to the former deal. I really want to say what I think. My position, I say it to all my compatriots when I meet them all over the world. Going back to the Iran deal from 2015, or even it's going to be a similar deal with a few improvements, is a bad thing. It's a wrong thing. It's bad operatively and it's bad strategically, because again it's going to enable at the end or even before the end to enrich quantities, to develop centrifuges or even the capabilities of the weaponry, and then storming towards a bomb. In strategic level is very severe because it's going to be an intolerable threat on the state of Israel, and it's going to drag a whole regional nuclear efforts. Therefore, everything that's similar to the current deal or improved one is a bad thing. It's not the right thing. We cannot allow it. Moreover, Iran of today is not Iran of 2015 when the former deal was signed. Iran today is under very heavy pressure. Economic, inflation, bitterness, incitement among the population. Their trade has sunk down. Iran today has very heavy pressure, and these pressures that are thanks to the sanctions of the Americans, but these pressures have to continue in any way, no matter what happens. Anything that takes away these pressures is going to enable them to have oxygen and air, and they can drag time, and at that time they'll continue to violate the current deal. There must be a very extreme action that at the end of it there'll be no capability, not just for a bomb, but no capability to storm towards a bomb on the part of the Iranians. And in spite of everything I described and all these pressures, Iran at the end can make a decision that it is advancing towards a bomb covertly or overtly. In view of the basic analysis, I ordered the IDF to prepare a few operative plans in addition to what we have already, and we are working on these plans and we're developing them. We will develop them during the next year. Whoever decides on implementing is, of course, the government. But these plans have to be on the table, they have to be ready, and they have to be documented. To conclude, I would like to talk about two of the challenges of this time. The first one, of course, is the coronavirus. From the moment this pandemic began, the IDF said loud and clear, I am here for anything that you need. Resources, equipment, experts, management, anything. We took part in scores of areas in all the authorities. We managed the hotels. We gave food. We created a digital information system. 30,000 people in the IDF were under the stretcher of the war against coronavirus. We established the information center and the command to cut the chains of infections, and we also opened a technological incubator which has to develop means that will enable regular life even during coronavirus. I talked to quite a few of my parallels, my peers. I tell you, there is no such thing to this participation of the IDF and this effort to halt COVID-19. I must say that we shall continue. Whenever there's a possibility, an opportunity, whenever we are called, we're going to stand and say all the time, one word, here I am. In parallel to that, we had the challenge of managing the IDF with the coronavirus. Think about it. The IDF, in its essence, is anti-social distance. The army works in teams, in brigades, in the tank, in the Golani Brigade. We fight together, we train together, we sleep together. Despite all that, the IDF continued to function, continued to perform all its activity, and no unit was harmed and didn't lose its capability. The second challenge is the budget. Like many other bodies in Israel, the IDF has been coping for 2 years with the challenge of budget. Such a big organization of security and defense, this is a very great challenge. But first of all, we determined the first principle that we, with our own forces, by ourselves, are going to create the resources to continue the functioning and the advancement of the IDF. We said, guns come before socks. And in fact, that's what we did. We founded a lot of resources for operational attack means and to build the force of the IDF. We closed some of the brigades and units. We closed a few bases. All that first of all, we, self-example, we're going to do everything possible. A huge sum, it's almost 3 billion shekel that we moved from one side to the other in order to participate in this effort. I am aware of the social difficulties we are living with the people. The IDF is the army of the people. But I want to tell you that the missiles and the rockets of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian, the missiles and the rockets, they do not cough. They're not sick with corona and they don't have problems breathing. The missiles are not sick, but they can be launched the moment somebody on the other side will decide that this is what they want to do. We don't have any indication at the moment that our enemies have reduced significantly their strengthening. They continue. Wars can happen even if they are not planned. This experience we also have, the IDF, in the last decades. Therefore, the IDF must be strong, must be ready. The IDF must be relevant and operational and capable all the time. That's what we're dealing with. This is our duty. This is our designation. The IDF continues with operations, continues to defend, continues to train, and the IDF continues to supply safety and security. And on a personal note, you know, there's the general who comes back from war and explains that he lost because he didn't have all the means and there were a lot of gaps and difficulties. And there's another general who comes back and says, I won in spite of the fact that there were quite a lot of difficulties and didn't have a lot of means. I request from us the second approach, even if it has to do with climbing, with rocky land against the wind. I require from my men and I require for myself, on me and on them, is the mission to defend, to get ready for war, and to be victorious. That's what they're concentrating on. That's what I'm concentrating on. And if I mentioned my people, my men, I would like to conclude with them as well. In IDF, there are great people, really wonderful people in all levels, both permanent army and in the regular army. Many people of the reserves have recruited by thousands to the effort against the coronavirus. Those people who serve work very, very hard, day in, day out. I visited this morning in a maneuver of the Givati Brigade. I want to tell you, you cannot come out of there with a different sense, a sense of military force, capability, a sense of adaptivity, and high motivation for command. And I'm telling you, I am a lot in the IDF. In most of the places in the IDF, there's a good spirit, a will to remain in the army, and I cannot but appreciate great appreciation that I have to all people who serve in the army and their families. They are part and parcel of this effort and part of the load. We're going to continue to foster them. We'll foster them first and foremost based on the significance of what they're doing, based on their own fulfillment and their national fulfillment. But I want to say one more thing. In order to attack in Arena A and to defend in Arena B and to storm in Arena 3, which is the third circle, and all that within 24 hours, you want the best commanders, the best men. The people of Israel want the best men and the best commanders. The state of Israel wants the best soldiers, the best commanders. We are there anyway. We are doing it out of a sense of satisfaction, a sense of privilege, and a sense of designation. That's the way everybody feels, and I am at the head of all that. Thank you very much.